There are 23 houses on Brightfield Court, in the suburb of Dunmore Heights, Ohio. On a Tuesday morning in early October, 22 of those homeowners woke up and turned on their kitchen lights without incident. The 23rd homeowner, 54-year-old man named Gerald Marsh, woke up to find that his power had been cut, not by the utility company, not by a storm, not by a tripped breaker or a blown transformer at the end of the street, by his HO or, more precisely, by a private electrical contractor named Rollins & Sons LLC, who had arrived at 6:45 in the morning with a service order signed by one, Diane Kettner, president of the Brightfield Estates Homeowners Association, authorizing the disconnection of electrical service to the property at 14 Brightfield Court, a single-family home on a quarter-acre lot with a gas-powered garage heater that had apparently been running for 11 consecutive days without permission. Gerald stood on his front porch in his bathrobe and watched the Rollins & Sons truck pull away. His house was dark, his refrigerator was off. His sump pump, which had been running on account of the heavy rain that week, was also off. He looked down at the service disconnect notice attached to his front door, Form number BC7, CC&Rs Section 12-4, Continued Operation of Unauthorized Mechanical Equipment After Notice to Cure. He read it once, he read it again. Then he went inside, picked up his phone, and made a call. The person he called was not a lawyer. It was not the state attorney general's office. It was not a journalist or a television news producer. It was a woman named Carol Thibodeau, who was the chief operating officer of Lakeview Regional Energy Partners, LLC, the private electrical utility that served Dunmore Heights, Ohio, 11 surrounding townships in the greater Westfield County area. Gerald Marsh was her boss. He had been her boss for 9 years, ever since he purchased a controlling interest in Lakeview Regional through a holding company called GRM Capital Advisors, was also how he had purchased the home at 14 Brightfield Court, quietly through a subsidiary LLC, with his name appearing nowhere on the deed search. Most people would think to run. Gerald Marsh owned the power company. The Brightfield Estates HOA had just cut his power. Drop your city and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many are watching from behind enemy lines right now. To understand how Gerald Marsh came to own a house in a subdivision governed by the Brightfield Estates Homeowners Association, you need to understand something about Gerald Marsh, which is that he is constitutionally incapable of retirement. He had spent 31 years in the utility sector. He had started as a lineman for a regional co-op outside Dayton, worked his way into operations management, by his mid-40s had built enough of a reputation to attract serious private equity interest. GRM Capital Advisors was the vehicle he used to acquire underperforming mid-size utilities and turn them around. Better reserve scheduling, renegotiated transmission contracts, infrastructure investment that the old co-op boards had been deferring for decades. Lakeview Regional had been one of those acquisitions. Westfield County had been running on aging infrastructure and a rate structure that hadn't been reviewed since the late 90s. Gerald had bought in, invested, and over 7 years had turned Lakeview into one of the highest-rated regional utilities in the state by customer satisfaction. His personal life was quieter. He had been divorced for 12 years, 2 adult daughters in different states, and had reached the point in his life where he wanted a house that was low maintenance, decent suburb, near a good hospital and a better golf course. A colleague had recommended Dunmore Heights. The homes in Brightfield Estates were well built. The neighborhood was quiet. The HOA, so the real estate agent assured him, was very well managed. He moved in during the second week of August and found the house to be exactly what he wanted. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, 2-car attached garage, and a detached third garage bay that he planned to use as a workshop. The detached structure was already wired for a standard 240-volt service drop, which was more than enough for a garage heater, and the occasional power tool. Gerald had a portable gas-fired infrared heater installed in early September, once the evenings started turning cold, because he intended to spend a great deal of time in that garage, and he had bad circulation in his hands. He received his first letter from the Brightfield Estates Homeowners Associate on September 14th. It cited CC&R Section 9.3a, restrictions on fuel-burning appliances in detached structures, and informed him that the operation of any gas-powered heating unit in a detached garage was a violation requiring prior board approval. The letter was signed by Diane Kettner, president. It requested that Gerald submit a variance application, Form BC3, no later than October 1st, along with a $50 processing fee payable by check. Gerald did not find this unreasonable. He requested Form BC3, paid the $50, submitted the application on September 22nd. The application included the make and model of the heater, its BTU output, its ventilation specifications, the installation receipt, and a letter from the installer confirming compliance with all applicable fire codes. On September 27th, he received a letter informing him that his variance application had been denied by a vote of 3-1 at the September 24th board meeting. No explanation was provided. The letter, again signed by Diane Kettner, stated that he had 14 days to remove the heater or face daily fines of $75 under CC&R Section 14.1, Continuing Violation Assessment. Gerald had been in operational disputes for 30 years. He knew bureaucratic friction when he saw it. He also knew that variance applications were supposed to be evaluated on their merits, not denied without explanation. He responded in writing, citing Robert's Rules of Order and the Ohio Planned Community Law, specifically Section 531209, which required that a denial of a variance application be accompanied by written findings. He asked for the board's findings within 7 days. He received no response. On October 3rd, a notice was posted to his door citing an ongoing violation of CC&R's Section 9.3a and informing him that fines had begun accruing as of September 28th, 5 days earlier, which was 2 days before his 14-day cure period had even expired. The notice also cited a new violation, CC&R's Section 12.4, the provision about continued operation of unauthorized mechanical equipment. The notice was signed by Diane Kettner, handwritten at the bottom, "Further escalation possible if violation continues." Further escalation, as it turned out, sending a crew from Rollins & Sons LLC at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning to physically disconnect the electrical service to Gerald's property at the main disconnect. Not the heater's dedicated circuit, not even the detached garage's sub-panel, but the main service entrance to the entire house. Now that you know Gerald, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has done. The conversation between Gerald Marsh and Carol Thibodeau lasted 4 minutes. He told her what had happened. She confirmed that Rollins & Sons was not on Lakeview Regional's approved contractor list and had no authorization, express, implied, or otherwise, to disconnect service to any property in Lakeview's service territory. She told him that what Rollins & Sons had done was, at minimum, a violation of the Ohio Public Utilities Commission's service continuity rules under OA 4901-110, and possibly something considerably more serious depending on who had directed them. Gerald told her he had a copy of the service order, signed by Diane Kettner. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would have a reconnection crew at 14 Brightfield Court within 90 minutes, and that she would also be calling Lakeview's legal counsel. The reconnection crew arrived in 73 minutes. Power was restored to Gerald's house at 9:47 in the morning. His refrigerator had been off for approximately 3 hours and 10 minutes. Sump pump had fallen behind by about an inch of accumulated groundwater in the basement collection well, which was corrected within the hour. Gerald spent the rest of that Tuesday reading. He read the full text of the Brightfield Estates CC&Rs, which ran to 61 pages and had last been amended in 2019. He read the board's meeting minutes for the past 24 months were publicly accessible under Article VI, Section 4 of the CC&Rs. He read the association's financial statements, which had been filed with Westfield County as required by Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.12. Several things caught his attention. The first was that Rollins & Sons LLC appeared in the HOA's vendor register. They had been awarded a contract for grounds maintenance and infrastructure services in January of the current year, an annual rate of $18,600. A contract that had not, as far as Gerald could determine from the meeting minutes, gone through a competitive bidding process. The previous grounds contractor, a company called Greenfield Property Services, been dismissed in December of the prior year after 12 years of service. The minutes of the December meeting contained the following notation: motion to terminate Greenfield contract approved 3-1. Motion to approve Rollins & Sons contract approved 3-1. No documentation of any solicitation of bids was attached. The second thing Gerald noticed was the identity of the dissenting vote on both motions. Every 3-1 vote in the past 14 months had been opposed by the same board member, a man named Paul Renfrew, who represented the residents of the eastern section of the subdivision. Gerald did not know Paul Renfrew, yet he intended to. The third thing Gerald noticed was that in March of the current year, the board had approved a special assessment of $412 per household for reserve fund replenishment and infrastructure maintenance, totaling approximately $9,476 for the 23-home community. The assessment had been collected. Gerald, as a new homeowner who had closed in August, had not yet been billed for it, but that was beside the point. The reserve fund balance shown in the financial statements as of the most recent quarter was $11,200, which meant that, before the special assessment, it had been approximately $1,800. For a 23-home community managing common areas, exterior lighting, the community entrance, and a decorative pond with a fountain, that was an alarmingly low balance. Gerald had spent 3 decades managing reserve funds for utility infrastructure. He knew what a healthy reserve looked like, and he knew what deferred maintenance looked like when it was being papered over with special assessments. He also noted that the fountain at the community entrance had been broken for, according to one resident complaint in the September minutes, at least 8 months. He called Paul Renfrew that evening. Paul Renfrew turned out to be a 58-year-old retired high school principal who had lived on the eastern section of Brightfield Court for 11 years. He had been elected to the board 3 years ago on a platform of financial transparency and had spent the subsequent 3 years being outvoted on nearly every substantive motion by Diane Kettner and her 2 allies, Trevor Hollis, who owned the property adjacent to Diane's and served as the board's secretary, and a woman named Marguerite Foss, who served as treasurer and had, in Paul's estimation, not read a financial statement with any real attention in her life. Paul had been raising questions about the Rollins & Sons contract since January. He had been raising questions about the reserve fund since the previous spring. He had asked, at 4 consecutive meetings, for the board to provide documentation of the bidding process for the Rollins & Sons contract. He had never received it. He had also, he told Gerald, not known about the plan to disconnect Gerald's electricity until he read the notice in the meeting minutes the following morning, which meant that Diane Kettner had authorized that action without a board vote. Gerald absorbed this information. Then he asked Paul 2 questions. The first was whether he was familiar with Ohio Revised Code Section 53T1213, the provision governing special meeting petitions in planned communities. Paul said he was generally familiar with it. The second was whether Paul thought he could identify 6 other homeowners in Brightfield Estates who were dissatisfied with the current board's governance. Paul laughed, a short, quiet laugh that contained almost no humor. He said he thought he could probably find 16, 3,847 in fines, liens, and disputed assessments. accruing against Gerald Marsh over a garage heater. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done? Fine total, by this point, had climbed to $3,847. It included the accrued daily assessments at $75 per day from September 28th through the date of Gerald's initial response letter, a reinstatement fee under CC&R's Section 14.3a for administrative processing of ongoing violations. Newly added citation for failure to maintain landscaping buffer per CC&R's Section 7.2, which referred to a 2-inch gap between Gerald's side yard mulch bed and the property line that was, by any reasonable measurement, visible to the naked eye, and a notice of intent to file a lien against the property under ORC Section 53-111, 18 if the outstanding balance was not paid within 30 days. Gerald did not pay. Gerald instead retained an attorney. Attorney's name was Harriet Xenko, and she practiced community association law out of a solo office in Westfield County. She had spent 22 years doing nothing but HOA disputes, and she had a way of reading a CC&R's document that was less like legal analysis and more like autopsy. She called Gerald 4 days after he retained her and told him what she had found. The disconnection of service, she said, was the most straightforward issue. CC&R's Section 12.4 authorized the board to arrange for the remediation of continuing violations at the homeowner's expense, but remediation in the context of an unpermitted appliance meant removal of the appliance, not disconnection of electrical service to the entire property. No provision of the Brightfield Estates CC&Rs and no provision of Ohio law gave a homeowners association the authority to disconnect a homeowner's utility service. What Diane Kettner had authorized, what Rollins and Sons had executed, was not enforcement of a covenant. It was interference with a utility service in violation of OAC 4901-1110. It exposed both the HOA and Rollins and Sons to civil liability. The fine schedule, Harriet said, had a second problem. The daily assessment under CC&R's Section 14.1a required that the homeowner be given written notice of the specific violation, opportunity to cure, and a hearing before fines began accruing. Gerald had submitted a written variance request, which had been denied without the required written findings. He had submitted a written request for those findings which had gone unanswered. Under Ohio HOA law, the fine schedule was procedurally defective from the beginning. None of the $3,847 was legally collectible. The landscaping citation was, in Harriet's word, decorative, existed to inflate the balance and make the lien threat look more substantial. It would not survive a challenge. The variance denial itself was the most interesting question. Harriet had reviewed the CC&R's Section 9.3a and the board's denial letter. Ohio Revised Code, Section 531209, required that variance denials be supported by written findings demonstrating that the variance would harm the community or violate the CC&R's stated purposes. The board had provided no findings. Under state law, the denial was procedurally void. Gerald's heater had been, in the technical sense, operating legally throughout the entire dispute. Gerald read Harriet's memo twice. Then he asked her what the path forward looked like. She told him there were 2 tracks. The legal track was a complaint to the Ohio Public Utilities Commission regarding the service disconnection, a letter to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section regarding the improper fines and lien threat, a civil suit against the HOA and Diane Kettner, personally, for the unauthorized utility disconnection. The second track was governance. Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.13 allowed homeowners representing 20% of the units in a planned community to petition for a special meeting. In a 23-unit community, that meant 5 homeowners. Paul Renfrew had already identified 9. Gerald told Harriet to file the OPUC complaint and draft the AG letter. Then he called Paul Renfrew and told him to start collecting signatures. Gerald just filed a complaint against his own HOA with the Ohio Public Utilities Commission, the same regulatory body that oversees the utility he owns. Right, Call? What's your strategy? Tell me in the comments. The petition for a special meeting was filed on October 19th, signed by 11 homeowners, nearly half of Brightfield Estates. The petition cited 3 agenda items. No confidence motion regarding the board's authorization of the utility disconnection without a board vote. A motion to rescind the Rollins & Sons contract and open a competitive bidding process. A motion to commission an independent audit of the association's reserve fund and special assessment accounts. Diane Kettner received the petition on a Thursday. By that Friday, her attorney, a man named Barry Fenwick, whose office was in the county seat and who primarily handled residential real estate closings, had sent Harriet Schenko a letter asserting that the petition was defective because it had not been notarized per Article VI, Section 6 of the CC&Rs. Harriet reviewed Article VI, Section 6, said nothing about notarization. She sent a response that was 2 paragraphs long and contained 1 footnote, which cited the specific text of the CC&Rs provision Barry Fenwick had referenced. She received no further response. The OPUC complaint generated a response within 10 business days. The Commission's Utility Enforcement Division sent a letter to the Brightfield Estates HOA, to Diane Kettner personally, and to Rollins & Sons LLC, requesting documentation of the basis for the service disconnection and advising all parties that the Commission was conducting a preliminary inquiry under OAC 4901-110. Rollins & Sons LLC's response was to hire their own attorney. Their attorney's first move was to provide the Commission with a copy of the service orders signed by Diane Kettner. Diane Kettner's response to the Commission was that she had believed she was acting within her authority as board president under CC&R's Section 12.4 Bob, and that she had relied on advice from the association's managing agent, who she identified as Barry Fenwick. Barry Fenwick was a real estate closing attorney who had no experience in community association law and had apparently never reviewed the CC&R's remediation provision with any precision. The Commission's preliminary inquiry became a formal investigation on November 3rd. The State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Section sent a separate letter on November 8th, acknowledging receipt of Gerald's complaint and requesting documentation from the HOA regarding the fine schedule, the variance denial, the lien notice. The letter noted that improper liens filed against a homeowner's property in violation of Ohio HOA statutes could constitute an unfair and deceptive trade practice under Ohio Revised Code, Section 1345.2. Meanwhile, Paul Renfrew had been doing his own reading. He had submitted a records inspection request under CC&R's Article VI, Section 4, asking for documentation related to the Rollins & Sons contract, all bids or solicitations for grounds services in the preceding 18 months, and all invoices paid to Rollins & Sons since January. The board had 30 days to respond. Paul received on day 28 a packet of 11 pages. It contained the executed contract with Rollins & Sons. It contained no solicitation documents, no competing bids, and no bid comparison summary, because, as a brief cover letter from Trevor Hollis explained, the board had exercised its authority under CC&R's Section 11, 2A, to award contracts without competitive bidding in cases where unique circumstances warranted direct engagement. CC&R's Section 11, 2A, required that such an exception be documented in the board meeting minutes. The minutes contained no such documentation. Paul also noted that the Rollins & Sons LLC registration on the Ohio Secretary of State's website listed a single registered agent, person named Kevin Rollins, whose home address on the registration was on Parkview Terrace in the adjacent subdivision of Maplewood Grove. Paul ran Kevin Rollins's name through the county auditor's property records. Kevin Rollins's wife was named Dana Rollins, née Kettner. Dana Kettner Rollins was Diane Kettner's daughter. Paul put the property record printout in an envelope and mailed it to Harriet Schenko with a sticky that said, "Thought you might find this interesting." Harriet Schenko found it extremely interesting. She forwarded it, along with the records request documentation and the contract, to the Ohio Attorney General's office the following morning. She also forwarded it to the OPUC investigator who was handling the formal inquiry into the utility disconnection. The special meeting, which had been scheduled for November 14th after the petition process ran its course, was now carrying considerably more freight than it had been designed for. In the 9 days before the meeting, 2 additional things happened. The first was that Trevor Hollis, the board secretary, quietly submitted a letter of resignation, citing personal and professional obligations that prevent me from continuing in my volunteer board role at this time. He submitted it by email to Diane Kettner at 9:17 on a Thursday evening and did not copy Paul Renfrew. It was a procedural oversight that Harriet noted in a letter to the board the following morning. The second was that Marguerite Foss, treasurer, called Paul Renfrew. The call lasted 40 minutes. Marguerite said that she had not until recently understood the full scope of the Rollins and Sons relationship, that she had relied on Diane's representations that the contract was properly procured, that she had some concerns about several line items in the association's operational accounts that she had not previously raised because she had not felt confident doing so. Paul asked her if she would be willing to speak at the special meeting. Marguerite said she would. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community room of the Dunmore Heights Public Library. 20 out of 23 homeowners attended in person. 1 submitted a proxy. 2 were unreachable. Diane Kettner arrived with Barry Fenwick, who sat beside her and took notes on a yellow legal pad. Gerald Marsh arrived with Harriet Chenko. Paul Renfrew had organized the agenda. The meeting opened with Paul Renfrew calling the session to order. Diane Kettner objected that, as board president, she should be chairing the meeting. Paul cited ORC Section 5D312.3, which specified that a special meeting convened by homeowner petition was chaired by the petitioning homeowner's designated representative. He had been designated in the petition. The objection was overruled. The first agenda item was the no confidence motion regarding the utility disconnection. Harriet Chenko presented a brief summary of the legal issues, the OPUC formal investigation, the AG inquiry, the absence of a board vote authorizing the disconnection, and the procedural defects in the fine schedule. She was careful, precise, spent 11 minutes. When she finished, Barry Fenwick raised his hand and said that the board had acted in good faith under its CC&R's authority. Harriet asked him to identify the specific CC&R's provision that authorized disconnection of utility service to an entire residence as a remedy for an unpermitted garage appliance. Barry consulted his legal pad. He did not identify the provision because it did not exist. The no confidence motion passed 16-3. Diane Kettner, Trevor Hollis's successor pending appointment, 1 other board-aligned homeowner voted against. The second agenda item was the Rollins and Sons contract. Paul presented the records request documentation, the absence of competitive bidding records, the family relationship between Diane Kettner and the company's principal. He did not characterize the relationship. He presented it as a fact, showed the Secretary of State registration and the property record, and let the room reach its own conclusions. The room did not require much time. Marguerite Foss spoke for approximately 6 minutes. She said that she had reviewed the invoices from Rollins and Sons in detail in the preceding 2 weeks and that several invoices, totaling approximately $4,200, referenced services she could not match to any specific work she had observed being performed at the property. She said she wished she had asked these questions sooner. The room was quiet while she spoke. The motion to rescind the Rollins and Sons contract and open competitive bidding passed 17-2. The motion to commission an independent audit passed 18-1. The third item was not on the original agenda. 11 homeowners had signed a separate recall petition under CC&R's Article 6, Section 3, which required signatures from 40% of units. 10. To initiate a recall vote of any board member. The petition had 12 signatures. The recall vote for Diane Kettner was conducted at the same meeting as permitted under Ohio law when the requisite petition had been submitted in advance. The vote was 17-4 to remove Diane Kettner from the board of the Brightfield Estates Homeowners Association effective immediately. Diane Kettner did not speak during the vote. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and did not look up. Barry Fenwick wrote something on his legal pad. The interim board, consisting of Paul Renfrew, Marguerite Foss, a homeowner named Linda Ashworth, who had been nominated from the floor, was appointed to serve until the next scheduled annual election in February. The meeting adjourned at 9:51. After everything Gerald went through, was it worth it? Have you fought your HOA, won or walked away? Tell me your story. The OPUC investigation concluded in the following February. The Commission found that Rollins & Sons, LLC had performed an unauthorized disconnection of utility service to a residential property in Lakeview Regional Service Territory, in violation of OAC 4901-11027B, which prohibits any person other than the serving utility from interrupting electrical service to a residential customer without commission. Authorization. The Commission issued a cease and desist order against Rollins & Sons LLC and referred the matter to the Ohio Attorney General's Office for Potential Civil Penalty Proceedings. Rollins & Sons LLC subsequently dissolved its LLC registration in January, 6 weeks before the Commission's findings were published. The Attorney General's Consumer Protection investigation resulted in a consent agreement with the Brightfield Estates Homeowners Association, now operating under the interim board, in which the association acknowledged procedural deficiencies in its fine and lien practices and agreed to adopt revised enforcement protocols consistent with ORC Section 531209. The lien notice against Gerald Marsh's property was formally withdrawn. The outstanding fine balance of $3,847 was voided. The independent audit of the reserve fund produced findings that the interim board shared with all homeowners in a written report distributed in December. The audit found that the reserve fund had been maintained at a critically low level, inconsistent with the community's reserve study requirements, that the special assessment collected in March had been partially allocated to operational expenses rather than the reserve fund as stated, and that the $4,200 in Rollins & Sons invoices that Marguerite Foss had flagged could not be substantiated by any service records or documentation. The interim board referred those findings to the Westfield County Sheriff's Office. As of the following spring, that matter remained under review. Diane Kettner did not attend the annual election meeting in February. The annual meeting elected Paul Renfrew as board president by a vote of 10-0 with one abstention, Paul himself, who felt it was improper to vote in his own election. Linda Ashworth was elected to a full term. Third seat was filled by a homeowner named Marcus Webb, a software engineer who had moved in 3 years prior and had been attending board meetings as a spectator since the summer, increasingly baffled by what he was watching. The new board solicited competitive bids for ground services from 4 contractors. The winning bid came in at $11,400 annually, $7,200 less than the Rollins & Sons contract. The fountain at the community entrance was repaired in March. As for Gerald Marsh, the garage heater was, for the record, still in the detached garage. The new board's first substantive action at their organizational meeting in February was to approve Gerald's variance application, the same application that had been denied the previous September without findings. The approval took 4 minutes. Nobody voted against it. Paul had moved to table debate on the grounds that it was, the words he used at the meeting, probably the least controversial item any of us will ever consider. Gerald had also, by that point, disclosed his ownership interest in Lakeview Regional Energy Partners to the new board, because he was legally required to, but because he believed it was relevant context, and because he had no interest in that information surfacing. later in a way that looked like concealment. The disclosure was received without drama. Paul's response had been to nod slowly and say that it explained several things. Linda Ashworth had asked whether that meant the HOA got a discount on electricity. Gerald had said no. She had said it was worth asking. The civil claim against the HOA for the unauthorized utility disconnection was settled in April. The terms were confidential, but Harriet Chenko's billing records for the matter closed out shortly thereafter, which in her experience usually indicated that her client had been made whole. Gerald continued to use the garage workshop through the winter and into the spring. On quiet evenings, with the heater running and a project on the workbench, he could hear the fountain at the end of the street, fixed at last, running properly, the way it was supposed to have been running for the better part of the past year. He found it a satisfying sound. If you made it this far, you already know how this works. The Brightfield Estates HOA didn't do its homework. It didn't check who it was fining. It didn't check who owned the power. It didn't read its own CC&Rs carefully enough to know what it was and wasn't authorized to do. When the board president signed a service order to cut a man's electricity over a garage heater, she handed every legal and procedural advantage in the dispute to the one homeowner in the subdivision who had spent 30 years understanding exactly how utility infrastructure law worked. That's the thing about power. And I mean that in every sense of the word. The people who assume they have it don't always stop to check whether they actually do. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is exactly this: the homeowner who looked small and wasn't.